So, today is the final episode of How to World Build a Night. And I thought we'd close it out with a practical exercise. What was the day in the life of a historical knight, and how would that compare to a fantasy equivalent? Welcome to episode 4 of Just in Time World Building series on Knights with your host, Marie Mullaney. So we're going to do this by going through my A Day in the Life of exercise from World Building Blueprints. You can buy your own copy of World Building Blueprints by going to my website, and if you use the code NIGHT2026, you will get a discount at checkout on any of the digital editions, whether that is this PDF, which we're going to be working from, the EPUB book, or my audiobook. Okay, so A Day in the Life of is the last chapter in the book, and it helps you build out your cultures in full by going through different people's daily lives, right? So we're going to use that for nights, and we're going to kick off by going to describe the home and hearth. So here we want to consider questions like, where does this person sleep? What is their home built out of? All of those kinds of details. Do they have any pets? Do they have any food animals? And so on. So the medieval knight obviously lived in a castle, for the most part. Some of them would have lived in fortresses, some of them might have lived in manor houses, some of them would have lived in somebody else's castle. The first castles were the motte and bailey construction, so they had the kind of bailey, which was a lower area, and the motte, which was the stronger area, normally built on a hill. The important thing to always remember about castles is a castle is more than just a building. It's also a means of projecting power over the countryside. It is a strong point from where the knight can sally, and it gives him control over the area, right? And a castle housed much more than just the knight. Okay, there would have been a whole area for food animals. There'd have been a village around the castle where the peasants grew crops and where they kept cows and sheep and whatever, and they would have maintained the castle by paying taxes, normally not necessarily as direct money so much as through their produce. So they would have given eggs or cheese or cloth or whatever from their produce would have gone to the castle and to maintaining the castle, along, of course, with corvée labor. Castles would often have wells or some kind of stream inside the castle because of sieges. So once you have people besieging your castle, you want to be able to have your own water source so that you don't end up, dying from dehydration because you're being attacked. Of course, this was before your food preservation like fridges and so on and so forth. So unless you're in a fantasy world where you have the fantasy equivalent of fridges, your castle's going to preserve food through things like pickling and so on. The interesting thing, of course, is how would a castle change due to fantasy? And there's a lot of ways that you can think about that. So you could have magical defenses. You could have magical means of attack. You could have a mage as part of the defenses, and so you can have, like, instead of an archer's turret, you could have a place where a mage can stand and throw fireballs. And all those kinds of details would change how the castle appears. I did do a video on castles and fortresses and so on, which you can check out in the information card. And let's move on to our next exercise, which is hygiene and associated with it clothing. Okay, so here we're thinking about things like, how did people bathe? How did they wash their clothes? how many clothes did they have and what did they wear. So our classic medieval knight probably bathed alone, although there was some communal bathing traditions in medieval Europe, and there was certainly some sort of sweat lodge and sauna traditions, especially in the north. In Finland, for example, the sauna is a very long-standing tradition. But we have some evidence that knights mostly had like bathtubs brought uh, to their rooms and that they bathed there. In addition, I should also mention, like I said in episode 3 or in episode 2, that there is a ritual bath that knights take before they are knighted that kind of washes away their sin. There's this persistent legend that medieval people were dirty. They weren't. They probably didn't bathe as often as we did, but they certainly did bathe. In a fantasy world, I think you can do a lot with hygiene. You can have communal bath places, you can have saunas, you can have magic involved in some way. You could create showers. Early showers wouldn't be that hard to create if you've got a reliable means of heating water and just pumping it up a pipe and so on. So you've got quite a lot of options for including magic into your hygiene. Then in terms of clothing, so knights had a couple of different means of clothing. Of course, one of the most important things you need to think about in terms of clothing is sumptuary laws, which I made a video about. That is what people could wear in which classes and so on. And secondly, heraldry. Heraldry was so important to knights because it identified them on the battlefield. And they quite frequently had their heraldic devices painted on their armor, or at least they wore a tabard with the heraldic device on. It might have been on a banner that they carried, or a banner that their squire or page carried, and so on. This was part of their identification means. It identified them on the battlefield, it identified them in court, it was part of their symbology. Okay, so you very much want to include that heraldry in your fantasy knights as well. But there's also the fact that knights often wore armor, which I spoke about in the second episode where I spoke about kind of the gear of a knight. So you want to also think about armor and how magic influences armor, of course, either making that armor stronger or perhaps replacing that armor entirely or making the armor lighter. All of those kinds of things impact on what they wear. And then, of course, climate always plays a role with clothing. Food and drink remains one of the most interesting parts of world building, and one of the ones that is not used nearly as often as it should be. Food and drink's great. You can world build ingredients through it. You can world build strange animals through it. You can create a class hierarchy with food and drink. You can have rituals around food and drink, like a coffee ceremony, like they have in Ethiopia, or a tea ceremony, like they have in Japan. You can do a lot with food and drink. So, our typical medieval knights probably did have some kind of tea. Might have been made from berries or whatever, because tea proper, the tea bush, I'm not sure when that came to Europe. They might have had coffee, actually. Ethiopia is not that far from Europe, and there has been extensive contact between Ethiopia and Europe, and Ethiopia, of course, is the place where coffee comes from. So it's entirely possible that Europe might have had coffee early on. And then, of course, they very traditionally drank a lot of wine and watered wine and beer and so on, because the water wasn't always safe to drink and alcohol made it safer, as of course did boiling and so on. And then in European knights would of course eaten a lot of bread, because wheat is the staple of Europe. So in your world, think about what is the staple food, how would they eat it, what is the imported luxury, what do they drink in the morning, what do they drink just before they go to bed, all of these kinds of details. Personal economics, so how do they make money? And this brings us back to those taxes. A knight wasn't just a knight. A knight was also the manager of a thief, right? A thief with a F, not with a TH. And the fief that they managed had people in it who were growing food, who were growing flax crops maybe, who were weaving and all of these things. And all of these people owed the knight a certain amount of their produce in taxes, right? And in return, the knight protected these people. They protected them from raiders and from other ambushes and so on. And the knight also owed allegiance upward in the feudal chain to the one above him, and often paid taxes to the one above him. It's kind of like a whole little pyramid scheme. It's the pyramid scheme of governance, is feudalism. Made a video about that too. I'll link it in the information card. So that's how our personal economics for the knight works. And bear in mind also that there is this ransom culture with knights. So if a knight was captured or whatever, he might have had to pay out a lot of money in order to free himself, to get his armor or his horse back and so on. And so the knight might very well be broke and trying to extract additional wealth from his peasants. And speaking of that, just on that very same ransom and stuff, bear in mind that magic and fantasy can have a huge impact here, right? You could have a completely different way of taxing people. You could have resources that are magically orientated and so on. After dark entertainment. What did your knight do for entertainment? So knights did a lot of things for entertainment. They jousted. They heard stories told. They would have heard things like the Song of Roland as a story. They would have engaged. There would have been songs and dancing and feasting. All of these things were activities that knights engaged in, and they were also activities that knights invited other knights to in order to kind of flex their wealth. If you can throw a great party, it kind of flexes how rich and how wealthy you are and all of those kinds of details. So think about, in your world, how does that apply? Do you have bards? Do you have storytellers? Do you have people who put on plays? How does magic enter into that equation? Do they create a magical stage effect? What about sport and magic? Jousting was a sport. So what is the sport that your people engage in, that knights in your world engages in? Then we come to routines in the knightly life. Okay, so in this section we think about things like, what is the daily routine of a knight? So a knight's daily routine would vary quite strongly depending on what time of year it was and where in history we are, right? If he's at home and it's winter, which is not really the war season, and he's just managing his estate, his daily routine is probably get up in the morning, take stock of his estate, maybe manage a few things, do some maintenance on the castle, do some training indoors. He would undoubtedly have done some sword training and things like that to keep his sword skills fresh for summer, and so on. In the summer season, when it's much more war orientated, he might have been living in a tent. He might be going to war every day. He might be participating in jousts. If he's not in a war, he might be traveling from tournament to tournament and engaging in jousts and trying to win these tournament battles, which would bring in income. In terms of weekly and monthly routines, we come back to those tournaments. Tournaments would have been scheduled events hosted by different kingdoms and knights and counts and nobles of various kinds. And tournaments were the opportunity, of course, for a knight to gain status and wealth. Then yearly routines were tightly tied to the kind of Christian calendar, and knights would, celebrate Christmas and various saints' days and so on. And then in terms of life events, one of the most important ritual would of course been becoming a knight, and when a knight went through the whole thing of bathing and girding their loins and getting their spurs and all the rest of that. And then, a knight would obviously have probably a fairly spectacular funeral, as their heir would then put them to rest and, take over the land. A knight whose child was born, who's had the birth of a child, would undoubtedly celebrate that, because their whole system of governance depended on having a male heir. So especially having a male heir would have been important. And then, of course, at 7, a knight's child would have been sent away to fosterage to start their training as a page. So these are all kinds of life events in the life of a knight. So how would that work in your world with your fantasy knight? So think about things like life events and yearly rituals, and what are their routines? What is the difference between being on campaign, being a tournament knight, and being at home in your castle doing your kind of maintenance? Because these are kind of 3 different times of a knight's routine. And then finally we come to our what if questions in the day in the life of. And these are questions around how would a knight have traveled? So obviously in our world, a knight traveled by horse. And as I said in the training video, they normally had 3 horses. They had the jousting horse, which was the destrier, normally a stallion, and a very fractious horse. They had the courser, which was a calmer horse, either a mare or a gelding, which was battle trained, and they used them in battle, but they were not the kind of fractious charger, the destrier. And then they would have had a palfrey, which is a easy traveling horse that has a steady gait that you can travel with, and that keeps both you and your war horse fresh. In your world, of course, knights could have magical steeds. They could travel via teleportation. They could travel via mage. There's all kinds of different ways in which you can work with travel. I did a video about travel as well. I'll put that in the information card. Communication near and far. So knights in our world communicated by means of letter that they sent either via pigeon or courier. But you could build a postal service. You could have a magical means of communication. I did that in my world in Sangwheel Chronicles. I have magical birds that can find anybody once they've ingested their blood. So my nobles have got like little ampules of each other's blood that they preserve using crystals, and then the bird eats those blood crystals and carries a message off to the noble. And of course, this has developed now into a whole system where the noble himself doesn't give the blood. What happens is the noble has a message receiver in his castle, and that's the person that everybody has the blood ampule to, and then only the select family can directly send messages to the duke or whatever, right? So think about things like communication, both in terms of like close distances, and far distances, and how magic affects that. And then, of course, we have weapons and warfare. So this I went into a little bit with the training and gear video, the second video, but it is worth researching kind of the time period that you want to imitate, and thinking about how armor and equipment influences your knights. I didn't go too deeply into this because none of you seem that interested in the topic, and there are a plethora of channels who do weapons and armor videos. So I particularly like Skullgrim. I'll leave a link to his channel down below, and you can check out his channel for all kinds of details on all kinds of weapons. I also like Bloomik the Archer if you're looking for archery weapons. Then healing and magical knowledge. This is actually quite a big one in terms of fantasy. Bear in mind that knights lived in the medieval period where medical knowledge wasn't great. They believed in things like leeches and like thinning the blood, bleeding people, which wasn't always the best solution. When somebody is sick, you don't necessarily want to tap the blood out of them. But in your world, medical knowledge could be quite far advanced or could be influenced by magic. So people could be way, way healthier and in way better condition than they were during our medieval period, just because they have more medical knowledge. So it is worth thinking about like how that setup influences your world. And then our last question in our day in the life of is potential threats and hazards. Now, for our knights, that obviously came mostly from other people, but in your world, knights could be under threat from monsters. There could be demons. It could be any kind of situation where your knight is placed under threat by fantasy elements. Or you could look at political threats. Maybe the knight's lord is getting involved in a war that he shouldn't be, and now the knight's whole realm is under threat because of this potential conflict. So don't just restrict yourself to the physical threat and the monstrous threat. Also think about the kind of wider political threat and how that could influence your knight. And that is that for the Night series. I hope that you enjoyed this closeout of the Night series using the day in the life of exercise. How would a day in the life of your night look? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you soon for another.